I'm Effie Parks. Welcome to Once Upon a Gene, the podcast. This is a place I created for us to connect and share the stories of our not-so-typical lives. Raising kids who are born with rare genetic syndromes and other types of disabilities can feel pretty isolating. What I know for sure is that when we can hear the triumphs and challenges from others who get it, we can find a lot more laughter, a lot more hope, and feel a lot less alone. I believe there are some magical healing powers that can happen for all of us through sharing our stories, and I'll take all the help I can get.
Once Upon a Gene is proud to be part of Bloodstream Media. Living in a family affected by rare and chronic illness can be isolating, and sometimes the best medicine is connecting to the voices of people who share your experience. This is why Bloodstream Media produces podcasts, blogs, and other forms of content for patients, families, and clinicians impacted by rare and chronic diseases. Visit bloodstreammedia.com to learn more.
Hello, and welcome to the show. I'm so grateful that you're here with me today. So our newest episode of Once Upon a Gene TV, in honor of Mental Health Month, went live last week over on the Disorder Channel. Our guest is Crystal O'Loughlin, founder of Angel Aid. It's a global network offering services to rare mothers and caregivers. It's such a beautiful community, and they offer so many wonderful resources. So head over to the Disorder Channel and check out the show to learn more. You can download it on your Amazon Fire or Roku to watch. There's also hundreds of other rare disease films, so happy watching. Some really great news in today's episode. I'm joined with Mirum Pharmaceuticals CEO to chat about a huge success of a drug they developed for Alagille syndrome. You may remember hearing our beloved Anna Laurent way back on episode 36, talking about her life with Alagille and how it, especially the painful itch, affects her. Mirum Pharmaceutical focuses on rare liver diseases and works closely with these families to understand their daily lives. Their genuine connections with these advocacy groups reinforces their sense of urgency to create treatments for these diseases and to help make their lives better. Please enjoy my conversation with Chris Peetz. Hi, Chris Peetz. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. I saw Alagille in the email when it first came, and we all love Anna Laurent, so that was an automatic yes for me.
Awesome. Yeah, conversation you had with her was great. I appreciate you hosting this podcast and letting me be a part of it.
Absolutely. I know that as a parent of a little kiddo with a rare disease, our relationships with all stakeholders is so valuable, and it all fits together, and it's so important for us to collaborate and communicate and get this work done together. I'm all about helping make sure that we break down these silos because nobody's getting any work done that way.
Absolutely. I'm sure we'll kind of wander our way through some of the different ways that at Mirum, where we're working on a handful of different rare liver diseases that has really been part of why the company was even formed, and what we're trying to do all kind of comes from parents of kids with Alagille syndrome and PFIC that helped put these programs on the radar and got us pointed in the right direction to work on them.
I would actually love to start there. What was the beginning stages? What was the origin story of Mirum?
So we were founded just a little bit over 3 years ago, and our programs were actually inside a larger company, part of a company named Shire. That it's a rare disease focused company that is no more. It got acquired by a bigger company, as these things go. And the programs that we have at Mirum, it's two different medicines. One that's approved called LIVMARLI or maralixibat, that's approved for treatment of cholestatic pruritus in patients with Alagille syndrome. And then a second one that's in development for some other liver conditions called volixibat. So these two programs were being developed by Shire, by the larger company. And the short way to kind of describe it is they got a little confused by some of the findings in the early studies that were being conducted. As I'm sure you can appreciate with rare disease, a lot of the clinical studies are relatively small. You don't get large numbers to get a real clear picture of things in some of these settings. And they decided that they weren't going to take the program forward in-house anymore. And it was actually one of our co-founders, a guy named Mike Gray, who's on our board, had a relationship with some of the families that had been involved with the clinical studies of maralixibat in the early years. And their kids were doing really well. So had really nice responses on their itch. It's one of the really driving symptoms of Alagille syndrome. And our co-founder Mike was at a fundraising event for one of these groups and saw how great the families were doing that were on the study, and thought, hey, there's probably something here that needs some attention. And he and a handful of us teamed up together to start a company to pull it out and get it back on the right course.
I love that. What are some of the ways right now that you interact with this patient community?
We're active in a number of different rare liver diseases. So there's no kind of one approach or one way that we interact. But maybe I'll speak a little bit about the Alagille syndrome community in particular, given that where we're at as a company is really exciting time with our work in Alagille syndrome. But worth noting, there's a number of other kind of groups that we interact with and try and support new medicines for a number of these different rare diseases. But in Alagille syndrome, there is just a tremendously well-organized and energetic group called the Alagille Syndrome Alliance. And they've been around for many years, over 25 years. And our interactions with them, they help give us feedback on things across the board, on our research programs. As we've moved to make LIVMARLI available upon approval, they provide feedback that comes from the community, from their members. And so we look for, there's just a nice conversation with them about, hearing what the experience is like for the families dealing with Alagille syndrome, and helps us make sure we're getting the right access for LIVMARLI as a new medicine available. And that conversation with the Alagille Syndrome Alliance is a key part of that.
I know a lot of my listeners are highly motivated parents and families who are raising money and funding research and, giving money away to get research done and to get therapies developed. And that is hard. That's hard. But also, I know that making the therapy is extremely complicated. Can we talk about this one in particular and what it actually does and what symptoms it's treating for these patients?
Absolutely. So LIVMARLI, it's an oral medicine. So it's a liquid medicine that kind of a format that looks like children's Tylenol. And what it does is it blocks the absorption of bile acids in the GI tract. So it blocks a transporter that's known as the ileal bile acid transporter. It's a protein that's in your GI tract that in normal function, 5 to 10 times a day, will reabsorb bile acids that are part of digestion. So you think about food, you eat foods, bile is secreted. It contains bile acids that help break down fats and part of just regular nutrient absorption. And the body reabsorbs those molecules themselves too, to reuse them. So there's this kind of normal recirculation of bile acids. In settings of cholestasis, and Alagille syndrome results in pretty severe cholestasis. It's among the most severe. That is a term that describes where bile acid flow is disrupted, and they end up with Alagille syndrome. Patients can end up with very elevated levels of bile acids systemically. So it's a digestive agent that then is at very high levels circulating throughout the body. So what LIVMARLI does is it blocks that reabsorption to help those excess bile acids pass out of the body. So you're just quite simply trying to get rid of excess accumulated bile acids. That's the intent of the medicine, what it's trying to do. And in the setting of patients, what we've seen in our clinical studies is that the itch that is such a huge burden for these patients, even to call it itch really almost gives the wrong picture of it. It's this described as just a relentless beneath the skin itching sensation that disrupts sleep. You end up with kids that will break their skin trying to get at this itch. And what we saw in the clinical studies is that the itch improves with LIVMARLI. And that's what the medicine's been approved for, is based on the clinical studies where you see itch improve in children with Alagille syndrome that have this cholestatic pruritus or itch.
I've seen a lot of the stories from patients in the Alagille community and how complex this itch problem is, not just from the insane need to do it, but all the other things that can happen, right? Like how it affects their mental health, how it affects their energy level, how it affects so many things. And I wonder, what were some of the key points that you've heard
feedback from the community of how this medication or this therapy has affected them that you were surprised by?
Well, I think the observation of just how devastating this itch is and how it just is pervasive across every aspect of life, and the overwhelming impact of it is what's so surprising. And we know it's an issue, but when you hear families talk about it, how they can't sleep and how they have trouble managing, because the family's not sleeping. They hear stories of people not being able to get to work, kids not performing well at school, and some of these other kind of observations on the clinical study where you hear about some of the fatigue scores improve. And we've also had some really interesting data from one of our academic collaborators that with long-term therapy, because this itch is improved, which in many cases is a reason to actually go for a liver transplant in patients with Alagille syndrome, that we may be postponing or deferring some of those transplant decisions. Early feedback from that is that by addressing this itch, you're getting at one of the major issues in caring for patients with Alagille syndrome. And that's just the pervasiveness of it, on how much burden it causes. That's what's so striking about what we're hearing about early feedback from families starting LIVMARLI.
That's incredible. What's your favorite part of the process so far in your work?
Oh, I guess it's hard to pinpoint it. It's all been, I must say, just such a amazing program to be a part of. And the way that all stakeholders have come together around this, I think is one of the highlights to comment on. You mentioned a little bit about how the company was formed, with some of the just relationships, seeing and knowing that there were families seeing an effect from the studies. But then that was carried forward in conversations with FDA, and the regulators being really open to recognizing what the burden and unmet need is for Alagille syndrome. You see them do this in a number of different rare disease settings, where there was an open dialogue and conversation with them on the studies that we had ongoing. And we went to them and said, here's what we're seeing, and what kind of analyses should we run? What else do we need to file this for approval? And had a really just supportive conversation with FDA, and also, the Alagille Syndrome Alliance also being part of that conversation, helping to just have this, multi-party conversation about how to get a new medicine available was just an amazing experience to go through. And the result really being so rewarding to now have a new medicine available for the cholestatic pruritus and Alagille syndrome.
Yes. I imagine there were some popping bottles in the office when that happened.
It was an exciting moment, but we're so semi-virtual right now that it takes a little bit of the sizzle off of it. Across the board, we're still have to pinch myself at times. And it really comes home when you get to have a conversation with a family. We've had a few opportunities like that through either the Alliance or also just through some of our own activities, where families have reached out and given their feedback on how impactful having a new medicine is. And that's why we're in this business.
Yes. Well, and as a caregiver to a child with a different rare disease, I see what companies and like you are doing at Mirum, and that's a win for me. You might not be curing my son's rare disease of CTNNB1. Let me know if you want to. But when I see this happening, this is a win for all of us. We're all cheering on when our friends get a rare disease treatment or therapy or some sort of drug, because it's pushing rare disease forward no matter what. Absolutely.
That's what, as a group, that's what we're trying to do, is find more LIVMARLIs, more settings where our current medicines can have an impact like this. It's addictive, I gotta say. When you have gone through the past few years with the company, just want to keep going and find more.
Do you feel like there's a different kind of energy with all of the stakeholders in what you're doing now with rare disease than perhaps other pharma or biotech companies that you've worked for in the past?
Absolutely. I feel it everything day to day, just And it just comes down to the impact and the potential stakes for everybody involved are so meaningful. For rare disease, a lot of these different medicines that we're working on and that you see other companies working on, the impact can really be life-changing and means so much that it brings that dedication and passion, not only from the families and the parents like yourself, but also for employees and us, as we're building out the company. It's a great rallying cry. People want to work for something that can have that kind of dramatic impact on the lives of others. So we see the energy in the people here at Mirum. We see it in other companies in the industry. And it's part of what gets you excited to get out the door in the morning.
Yes. Well, I know this is obviously extremely expensive to do what companies like yours does. And most people don't want to touch rare disease with a 10-foot pole because there just isn't enough data, there aren't enough patients, and there's no money. But what about the other side? What about the fact that science is moving at such an incredible pace and it's so exciting and we're learning new things every day and we're finding new genetic codes every day? Like, how can you not want to be in that part? Like, how do you make those decisions?
The complexity of the science really can be overwhelming, right? And that's the backdrop that we try to navigate, is that, any disease process, let alone a rare disease where you don't know as much. There's not as much published. There's not as much understood. As we look at kind of where we think we can make an impact, we try and find areas where you can see through the science and have that, really, end of the day, it can be a really simple observation, like in the cholestatic settings. The bile acid overload is causing issues. What if you find a way to lower the bile acid levels? So those kinds of ways that you can cut through a lot of noise in the science ultimately is where you can find products that you can make it across the finish line. They're easy to understand. It's easier to design a study and know what to measure. That's often a problem, especially in emerging areas where you sometimes don't even know what to measure when you're testing a new medicine. So that's one of the lenses we look at on kind of where we're going next, where to invest the money that we do have towards new potential medicines.
How do you decide what other rare diseases that you want to treat? Like, what's in your pipeline, if you can answer that, if that's not a secret? Or like, how do you even get these ideas?
Currently, the stuff that we're working on, our pipeline is really focused on bile acids. So right now, our next kind of two big missions in my mind on what we're trying to do in the near term with Mirum as a company. One is to just broaden access to LIVMARLI as much as possible. So making sure that patients with pruritus due to Alagille syndrome have an ability to gain access to treatment as appropriate. And the second one is to take what we've learned from the Alagille syndrome experience and take that across other liver diseases that have some similar issues with bile acids and pruritus. And that's what's in our pipeline. So we're looking at what we've learned kind of back again to, cutting through the noise in the science and finding something that seems clear, is that these bile acids are driving a lot of the pruritus in these different settings. And that's where we have 5 other indications. And a lot of it's oriented around that, taking what we've learned and expanding the impact of it. And then kind of the where next is a little bit more open-ended, and we have a high bar. We want to find potential new medicines that can have an impact like what we're seeing with LIVMARLI, things that, we ultimately can get approved and help patients and families get access to.
That's very cool. How do you broaden access?
Right now, we're kind of in the midst, early days of launching LIVMARLI commercially in the U.S. And so our focus in the U.S. has been a lot based on our patient hub. So we have a patient hub called Mirum Access Plus, and it's a team of folks that are dedicated to the LIVMARLI program that families can call, that physicians can call, and just to make sure that we're supporting any questions people have as they're considering treatment options. So making sure we have trained people that can help the families and the prescribers navigate any questions or processes that they might need to in considering starting their patient, or if their patient is appropriate for prescribing LIVMARLI. Then the other piece of that's geographic, right? So we're launching in the US, but the Alagille syndrome is a global disease. From what we see, it presents at a pretty similar rate around the globe. So we've done a lot of work on finding ways to get approvals outside the US. Right now, we're in review in Europe. So there's a very similar app to FDA, a European regulatory body that has its own process and procedures that we're in the midst of. We've got a team of people in Switzerland that are going to help set up the distribution and access for patients in Europe. And then we've also signed up other companies in other countries around the world. So distributors and license partners that can essentially broaden our reach, because we're a pretty ambitious group, but also know our limitations that, there's some countries where we won't have the bandwidth or ability to commercialize there. So we sign up partners to help get access for those patients.
Wow, that is so intense. There's just so much extra behind the scenes that goes on to get these drugs out. And also just kind of annoying, right? That if you have this diagnosis, you can't just get a medication because of your geographic area.
It can be surprisingly complex. And each country, as you'd expect, has its own regulatory environment. And so each country is a little bit different on how you help families get access.
Just out of curiosity, do companies like yours figure out ways to repurpose the drugs that you've created or the therapies that you've created?
In a way, I think repurpose probably isn't the word that I would use to describe it, but it's to the point I was making about some of the other cholestatic diseases that we're active in. It's more running the studies to see if you have a role in some other similar diseases or diseases with similar bile acid issues. Some might call that repurposing, but really it's running studies to broaden the reach of LIVMARLI. And then volixibat, our second drug, is a similar idea where we're testing it in 3 different adult liver diseases. The kind of interesting point to make on repurposing is that originally the molecules that are our products were originally designed with different diseases in mind. They were originally designed to lower cholesterol because bile acids are related to cholesterol. And it wasn't until partway through some of the clinical studies that it was realized that, hey, this is directly active on bile acids. Wouldn't it be more relevant to test these in diseases of bile acids? So kind of the repurposing happened even before we started.
Wow, that's super cool. What are some of the ways that advocacy groups and general rare disease groups can help push forward, like help get these things approved, help get these in other countries? Like, do they play any piece in advocating for that, or is it all bureaucracy?
They play a huge role. Yeah, it's the impact that the patient groups have in working through the regulatory processes, and outside the US, the reimbursement processes, they get involved quite a bit as well. And the impact is massive that they for the role they play. Because back to the main issue with rare disease is that it's rare, and the patient groups provide that voice and awareness that can help educate regulators. A great example of FDA. FDA's got these patient-directed forums for they're basically listening sessions that they've set up to basically an opening for patient groups to come and talk about their experience with the disease. Those can have a huge impact on helping educate FDA and help them find ways to give pathways for companies to develop new medicines. And there's similar, it's in slightly different formats in each country. Again, back to the global complexity here. The patient groups do so much to educate not only the regulators, but the researchers too, and just being able to talk about what is the experience like in dealing with the very complex aspects to any given rare disease. It helps researchers understand, what should we measure? What are we looking at in these clinical studies? It helps the regulators then understand what they can use as a basis to evaluate and approve the medicine.
Yes, good. I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, I think that the personal stories from the patient and caregiver population can be transformative, right? And it can help people who are doing this serious job and, following all these rules all the time actually kind of stop and go human to human and be excited about why they were there in the first place. And I just think magic can happen when you're hearing from the community itself.
Absolutely. It is the reason why we're developing these medicines. So if you're not talking with the families or patients and hearing their perspective on it, it's hard to be on point. That's why we're here, is to develop products for the families and patients.
What would you say are some of the misconceptions about pharmaceutical companies, and what do you hope that more of them get better at?
Well, I think the attention and desire to really hear the patient experience and develop products that are relevant for the day-to-day burden of disease is something that can get lost in the shuffle of large companies. And that's something that, as an industry and as a small company, I think everybody's trying to stay more patient-directed. And so you see some bigger companies at least have the perception of not being as attentive to that. From the day one at Mirum, we've tried to make that a core part of who we are, and I hope we continue to do that, and hope that other pharma companies continue to increase their efforts as well. That's why we're here, is making products for patients. So having that patient voice and experience be front and center is a key part to all this.
100%. All right. Well, I'd love to know about upcoming goals, things you're excited about with the company for the next couple years.
Yeah, I mean, for us, looking ahead, it's the point on broadening access. So getting further into the commercialization of LIVMARLI for pruritus and Alagille syndrome. And then we have 5 really exciting clinical studies in different rare diseases that are following. So we have 2 more pediatric settings where we're testing LIVMARLI. We'll have a readout from our study in PFIC, progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis, later this year, and a study in biliary atresia, adult studies in primary sclerosing cholangitis, primary biliary cholangitis, and intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy. So a lot of cholestasis words I've thrown at you there, but these are all just rare diseases where the bile acids have kind of run amok. And very excited about all of our studies ongoing in these other settings. I hope that we can have an impact like we're having in Alagille syndrome.
Yes, that's so exciting. How do people find out if they fit into one of your clinical trials? Where do they get this information?
The first easy source is clinicaltrials.gov, and that's government-hosted website, and our studies are there with the details. It can be a little technical, so we also, from our website, from the Mirum Pharma website, we have links to some study-specific websites as well. Just because the clinicaltrials.gov is not always the most user-friendly, but so a couple of places to go to. And then, of course, always going straight to your physician and asking about clinical research helps bring everybody to the table, actually. So that's another easy place to start.
Great. And with the clinical trials, I don't know if you know this answer, but is there some option to make it more accessible for people? Do people have to plan to pick up and move and for a few months, or are a lot of the appointments and kind of check-ins available to do online now?
It's a mix, and this is something that we struggle with because there are some regulatory requirements where you have to do some in-person visits. With the pandemic, it's lightened up some of those requirements, and we found ways to do more virtual visits where people might not have to go to a major medical center. And some of our studies are also kind of spread across the country too, and in other countries. So we try and get a good just geographic spread on where the study centers are, and then as much as possible limit the amount of kind of in-person visits as we can, just to, because that clinical trial burden, the visit burden, it's a real issue for participating in some of these studies. So we're trying to do our best to balance that.
Yeah, I think everyone needs their own clinical trial concierge.
Yeah, we have some services like that, actually. Those do help. They help to coordinate travel if there's travel involved and help with scheduling.
Well, Chris, I'm super excited to have learned about this, and I'm so happy for the community that you've been developing therapies for and just the global rare disease community in general. That means a lot to us, and it doesn't matter what diagnosis and what walk of life you're coming from. We're a tight-knit family, and I'm really excited to hear this news, and I wish you all the best of luck, and I'm happy to spread this message with my network and help however I can to push things forward with you.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you hosting me, and also just, thanks for the work that you do to be a voice for rare disease. It's great to have a platform like this for, the different families, researchers, and companies that are working in the space. It's much appreciated. It's good work.
Yes, thank you so much. It's my pleasure. I hope you've been enjoying this podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this show with your people, and please make sure to rate and review it on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also head over to Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to connect with me and stay updated on the show. If you're interested in sharing your story, or if you have anything you would like to contribute, please submit it to my website at effieparks.com. Thank you so much for listening to the show and for supporting me along the way. I appreciate y'all so much. I don't know what kind of day you're having, but if you need a little pick-me-up, Ford's got you.